So, this week we're going to have one particular failure that I want to look at, and I think we're going to learn a lot as we go through this. But first off, have you guys ever been asked a question that just completely flabbergasted you and you had no idea how to answer? Like maybe you get asked this question every day and you've never even thought about how you're supposed to answer it. You get in the car and your mom or dad says, "How was school?" Right? Hits you out of the blue every single day. You have no idea how to answer that. You're like, "What? How dare you ask me how school was? It was good," right? That's the only answer to that question. Good. School was good. And your mom's like, "Well, like, did you do anything?" "No." "Did you talk to anyone?" "No." Like, I don't want to talk to anyone right now, let alone your mom. Like, that question, like, I don't know. Every time I would get that as a kid, I just had no idea how to answer it. Or maybe the question is your parents, and they're like, "Hey, how come I went into your room at 2 last night and you weren't there? And now you're here at 8 a.m. Like, what? Has anyone ever had that question? You're like, "I never even thought that they might check my room, like, when I snuck out. Like, what the heck?" Or it's been like, "Hey, like, I let you borrow the car to go to Cumberland Farms to fill up with gas because you dropped the car off with no gas, and I told you to go get gas. And that's 2 miles away. It's been 45 minutes, and I just checked, and there's 100 new miles on the car. So where'd you go? What happened?" Or you say, "Hey, Mom and Dad, I'm going out to a friend's house. I'm going to hang out at John's house. It's going to be great. Just guys, it's just, me and John just hanging out, having a great time." And then you get back the next morning and your mom's like, "Hey, funny thing, I called John's mom because we're tight. And John was not home, actually. He was at camp this whole week. So where were you?" And you're just like, I don't know how to answer that question without getting grounded and killed. Like, we have these questions, and sometimes they just hit us, and we're like, "Oh my gosh, I have no idea how to answer this question." And we're going to talk about probably one of the most important questions that you can ask someone or that you can be asked. And we're going to look at how do we answer this. So we're going to look at the failure of not having an answer for the most important question. Do any of you guys... Any guesses what this question is going to be? Any guesses? Yes. The question is, like, why are you a Christian? Exactly. So this question comes up. Maybe you've asked someone this. Maybe that's the reason you're here. You ask someone and they're like, "Come to Elevate." Like, that was their answer, and you're like, "Okay, whatever." Or maybe you've had someone ask you this question at school and you just froze and you're like, "I never thought anyone would ever ask me this question. And now that I think about it, I have no idea." Like, has anyone ever had that? That's a little embarrassing. You're like, "I don't actually know." That was basically the story of my middle school. Because my parents go to church. Duh. So now I'm a Christian. So we're going to look at this, and I want to look particularly, sometimes when we get this question, we go and we don't know how to answer. And so maybe you'll go to arguments you've heard. Maybe a friend will come at you with like evolution versus creation, like after you go to a science class, and you're like, "I don't actually know. I've never done any research on this at all. I don't even know what you're supposed to think as a Christian." Or maybe someone will ask you about how old the earth is, and you're like, "Again, I don't know. I wasn't there." But like, you sound like you have some good evidence on your side. I don't know. Maybe like sometimes that's the direction that conversation goes. All of a sudden you're arguing and fighting with them over something that you don't even know. Like, I remember when I was in college, before I really became a Christian, when I was a Christian in name only, which meant I was an obnoxious jerk. You guys have probably met some of those Christians, right? Maybe you're at that stage right now. It's fun. Hopefully it'll pass. So I was at that stage where I considered myself a Christian, but had none of the Christian attributes that you expect, like love, joy, peace, kindness, goodness. I was obnoxious, and I hated myself, and I was a jerk. So hopefully things have changed. I think they have. But I remember I would get in these arguments with my roommates in college, and they weren't Christians, and like they would be drinking, and then all of a sudden we'd get in this like deep philosophical debate, and I'd just be like, you guys have no idea what you're doing, blah, 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 and like blah, blah, blah. And I remember one day they sat me down after one of these sessions, and they're like, Steve, we need to have like a roommate talk right now. Like, come out to the kitchen table. And I'm like, oh man, I'm in trouble. Like, what's going on? And so we come out and we sit down. They're like, Steve, we know that you're a Christian. That's really nice. And I know that you want us to be Christians too. But I just want to let you know the way you're doing it is not working. Like, you come across to us as an obnoxious jerk, and no offense, like, we think you're really nice, you're just a jerk. So if you could just like figure out another way to be a Christian that wouldn't be so annoying, that would be great. And like, honestly, for me, that was one of the best conversations I've ever had, because I was trying to do things. I'm like, oh, I'm being a Christian. I'm being a good witness. I'm like spreading my testimony. And the people that I was talking to were like, should we slit this guy's throat in his sleep? Because like, I don't know. I could go either way right now, because he's just driving us crazy. At least he's on the other side of the apartment, and like, we can avoid him. But like, what I was doing was not working. Maybe you guys have ever been in a position where you realize that what you're doing when you talk to other people about Jesus is not working. So I want to look at one guy in particular that what he did not work. And so later on, this guy's name's Peter. He's documented pretty well through the Bible. He's one of the earlier disciples of Jesus. He actually wrote a letter when he was older to some of the other churches that were going through persecution. And he gave him some really awesome advice about how to share your testimony. And we're going to read this, and then we're going to look back on how we think he got this insight and this perspective. So if we're going to look in 1 Peter 3:13 through 18. These verses will be on the screen. And the second section that we'll go to, you're going to have to look in your book. So this is Peter talking to a bunch of people that have been deported. If you've been in our Waters Church series recently, we've actually talked a fair amount about 1 Peter and what this letter is about. So he's writing to Christians that have been kicked out of their homes, forced to move somewhere else, and now they're trying to figure out, how do we act as Christians in this completely foreign environment? So he says, now who is there to harm you, if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. He continues, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteousness for the unrighteousness, that he may bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. Now, I know that's kind of long and definitely not how we normally word things these days. So the key thing that we want to look at here is in that first slide, where in verse 15, he says, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Doing this with gentleness. And so, how did Peter get this perspective? He's talking to these people, and he's saying, when people hate you, when people freak out on you, it's okay, chill out, don't worry about it. Like, even if they're saying wrong things like slander, if they're making up terrible stories about you, you can be okay with this. And when they do this, be so good that they're embarrassed to be making fun of you. Like, a lot of times, maybe you guys have heard this strategy at school. Like, you know that bully at school? The best thing to do is when the first time he tries to like steal your lunch money, you punch him in the face, and then he'll always respect you for the rest of the year. Now, you guys have probably figured out if you try to do that, you get suspended, right? Like, it doesn't end up working out good. And he ends up getting his posse, and he's like, yeah, thanks for that. I'm going to beat you up every day and make your life a living hell for the next 4 years. And you're like, man, Dad, that just wasn't good advice. He's saying, do the opposite. When people are saying wrong things about you, when they're making up stories, be so good that they're just so embarrassed to be even doing it to you. Like, I've said this before, but like, if a guy's beating you up at school and you are just super nice to him, you're going to freak him out so bad. Like, or this girl that's like always chatting you up behind, like maybe you were friends like the first couple of years of high school, then you had a falling out, and now you're like bitter enemies. And she's just always saying mean things about you, you're saying mean things about her. It's this vicious cycle. Like if you start like consistently being nice to that person and like always saying nice things to them, you are going to, like, honestly, you're going to freak them out so much more than being mean to them. Like, it's so much fun. You can just mess with people. Be like, oh yeah, no, you look really nice today. Really, you look great. Like you can just and legitimately be nice to them, and they're gonna freak out and be like, what the heck is wrong with you? And you do this long enough, they're probably gonna ask you about it. They're gonna be like, hey, remember how we were like arch nemesis, and like every time we passed the hall, like meow, 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 meow. Like, how come all of a sudden I'm like meow, 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 and you're like, meow. Like, what happened? Like, why are you so chill now? Like, why do you not even care? And you have to have an answer ready in that moment if this change was a result of your relationship with Jesus. So Peter has this perspective, but Peter did not always have this perspective. I'm going to do a lot of summarizing, and we're going to go through basically the first time Peter had to really stand up where people actually asked him this question. And then we're going to look at how Jesus handles this question. So, first off, maybe you guys have heard about Peter, maybe you've heard about Jesus, maybe you haven't. We're going to kind of go through the last couple days, or the last night of Jesus' life, and then like a couple days afterwards. And this is a really, really crucial time in history for everyone that was following up to that time, for Jesus, and also for you and me right now. So we're going to look at basically starting off at the Last Supper. I don't know, maybe you guys have heard about this before. Basically, Jesus was a guy about 2,000 years ago, and he lived for about 30 years, and then he started preaching. He started getting disciples to start following him. He claimed to be God. And so people either believed him or they didn't, and he had kind of like a closest group of 12 guys that he hung out with. Those were called his disciples or just followers. And so this night, he knows he's about to die. Like he believed he was God. That the evidence really points to him being God based upon what we see of how he lived. And he knew that what was coming up in his future was that he was going to die the next day. And so what he did was he's like, guys, we're going to have brunch right now. Like, we're going to have a dinner, family dinner. Before I go, we're going to get my house in order. And so he calls all of his disciples, and it's this Jewish feast time called the Passover, where they celebrated back way in the day when their nation was slaves in Egypt, when they got brought miraculously out of Egypt. And every year they would have a feast to celebrate, and they would sacrifice a lamb to represent how they were brought out in freedom. And so they would go and they would have a special meal where they would prepare a lamb, and it was like a huge deal. It was kind of like Thanksgiving almost in America. Like, you'd get the whole family together, everyone would share this meal. It was kind of like the equivalent of what Passover was, except it was much more significant than what Thanksgiving is. And so he gets them all together in one room. It's called the upper room. If you're looking at history, it's just, second floor. And so they're all up there. They're having this conversation. And Jesus starts kind of laying into him. He's like, guys, I'm going to die tomorrow. And then in 3 days, I'm going to rise from the dead. And you got to be ready for that. And they're like, absolutely not. That's not going to happen. We've been hanging out with you for too long. We believe you're God. There's no way you're just going to die. Like, God don't just die. That doesn't even make sense. And so Peter, who's one of his disciples, starts talking him up. He's like, Jesus, man, if you're going to die, I'm going to die with you. And he's like, I got a sword, actually. Like, I'm your bodyguard. I'm your bro. Like, I'm going to protect you. Like, there's nobody that's going to touch you. And Jesus says, Peter, you got it all wrong. Actually, tonight, you're going to 3 times say that you don't even know who I am. Peter's like, absolutely not. No way that's going to happen. It's like when you guys say, like, oh, we're going to be best friends even though you're moving to Arizona, and then they move, and like 2 days later, you never talk to them. This is basically what's happening, where Jesus is saying, hey, I'm going to leave. You're just going to totally forget about me. You're going to leave me. Don't worry, Peter, though. At least I prayed for you. Like, I know you're going to come out on the other side. So they have this whole conversation. Peter says, no way, not going to happen. They leave where they're at, and they go to one of Jesus' favorite places, which is called the Mount of Olives. It was a beautiful mountain with like olive trees Olives, naturally. So they go there to hang out. Jesus knows that he's going to be betrayed by one of his other disciples, one of the guys that was just there in the room. He keeps telling Peter and all those guys, be ready. Like, something big's coming. And they're like, yep, Jesus, something big's coming, and I'm going to sleep. And so they just fall asleep multiple times throughout the night. They're like the whole night. And then at the end of the night, Judas, who is one of Jesus' disciples, you may have heard that name, like it's associated with betrayal. Judas comes and leads a group of soldiers and army men to arrest Jesus. They show up, everyone panics, and Judas is like, all right, let's arrest the guy. Jesus is like, here I am. Peter and the other disciples are like, okay, what do we do? So you may remember Peter had that sword. So he does what I like to call the Buzz Lightyear. And he just immediately reacts, and he pulls out his sword, and he just chops off the ear of one of the guys that's coming to arrest Jesus. And Jesus is like, Peter, dude, like, you have no idea what's going on. He picks up the ear, puts it back on the guy's ear. He's like, all right, arrest me now, sir. Like, can you imagine that? If, like, the cop pulled you over, and then someone else, like, ran up, and they're like, no, cops are bad, and they, like, attacked the cop, and, like, chopped off his leg, and then you're like, no, it's okay, cop, and, like, you put the leg back on, and you're like, arrest me now. Like, that's insane. So the guy's like, okay, I'll arrest you, but I'm, like, freaked out right now. And so Peter and everybody else runs away. And so I'm going to have this first point here. When you're preparing to answer this question, why are you a Christian? You need to prepare for opposition. So the word prepare in that first passage you looked at, Peter, he also references Noah just a couple of verses later, and he talks about how Noah had to prepare, and he was the only one that was preparing for the flood. And so when you're preparing for this question, you got to be ready that at some point in your life, when you have to explain yourself, there's going to be some opposition. Not always, but there's a pretty good chance. And so Peter, he thought he was ready for opposition. He had a sword. He's like, all right, I'm all ready to go. Like, this is going to be awesome. And when the moment comes, he does everything completely wrong. He's not prepared. And then him and everybody else just runs away. So when you guys are getting ready for this question, you need to prepare. So what this can mean is you can either be ready for people to hate you when you hear the answer. You can also be ready for people to be ready and open. When I was preparing for this message, I talked with some of my non-Christian friends, like some of my atheist friends at work, and I was like, what do you guys feel about Christians? I was like, can I do like a quick survey here? Like, how do you guys feel about it? And like, what labels do you feel like, because we're going through this label series, I'm like, what labels do you feel like should be attributed to Christians and stuff? And they were like, like, we try not to be super judgmental on Christians, and like some of the labels that you guys have, like we're going to talk about the label anti-science coming this week. They're like, that's more geographical, I think, than anything else, and even like related to like what faith you have. They're like, we try not to label Christians as much because we don't like when we get labeled either. They're like, not all atheists are like, we hate God, we wish God was dead, blah, 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 everyone should die. Like, they're like, we're just like, we looked at the evidence, we didn't really see it, we don't really see God, and so we just said, hey, we don't believe in God. Like, you be careful that you don't label other people too. So when you're preparing for opposition, at the same time, don't be like, all right, they hate me, everyone hates me, I'm a Christian. Like, that's probably not going to happen. You're going to meet people. I've had so many people that I've invited at work. They're like, hey, it sounds cool, I'll go to church. And then they become Christians. It's like, cool, like, nice. And then you have other people where they're just like, no, I don't want to go. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. And it's not a big deal. Like, you just talk about it like normal people. But at the same time, you need to be prepared for opposition. So what happens when they encounter opposition in this thing? They scatter. The disciples all leave. Peter is one of the brave ones that actually follows Jesus behind. One of the books of the Bible, when it records a story, they talk about this guy that had just been following Jesus like from a distance, and they grabbed him to arrest him too, and he ran away, and all he was wearing was like an outer garment, and he just left it, and he ran away naked. He was like so scared. I just thought that was funny. So Peter's one of the few brave ones that actually follows Jesus, and he gets 3 times asked that night by random people. One of them is like a 12-year-old girl, like, hey, are you that guy that's been following Jesus? And each time he says no. He just, nope, nope, nope. Like maybe you guys have done that too, where people are like, hey, are you a Christian? Like I heard you went to church. Nope. What, me? No, you're talking about Billy in Homeroom 3. Like, no, that's not, that. I have never even been to a church before. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, maybe that's been your response, and then you leave, you're like, okay, maybe that wasn't the best response. I'm going to be a little embarrassed when I go to Elevate tonight. But you got to prepare that there's going to be some opposition when you do this. And so Jesus, basically, he gets falsely accused, and he gets executed. Like, to make a long story short. And his entire band of followers lock themselves in a room hiding because they're afraid that they're next. Someone's going to find them, and then their lives are over. Like, maybe some of you guys, you've had this where, like, maybe you thought you understood what Christianity was or who Jesus was, and then all of a sudden everything changes, and you're like, I'm not even sure I'm going to survive the next day. Like, I don't understand what's going on. I feel like there's so much opposition in my life to my faith. I'm just going to hide in my room and play video games, like, until this whole thing blows over. So that's what they're doing right now. They're just hiding out. And basically, Peter has failed big time. All of his disciples, everyone that's followed Jesus, instead of sticking with him to the last round, they watch him get executed. They hide, they run away. No one sticks with them. Everyone has totally bombed and failed this test. And it looks like this movement that Jesus started is over. It's just done. Like, it's not going to happen. Sorry, guys. I actually wasn't God. I'm dead. Sorry about it. Like, you guys can move on with your lives now. And so they're all so bummed out. They have no idea what's going on. They're completely depressed. They've spent the last 3 years following this guy that they thought was going to save them, and it just isn't working out. And I think a lot of times we forget to look about this situation from God's perspective. Because right now, he's really set himself up for failure. When you look at it, okay, you're dead, number one. So if you're trying to start a movement, usually being dead ends your movement. So he also, all of his guys are terrified, they're scared. Nobody's doing what they were supposed to do. He's been trying to tell them this is going to happen for the past 3 years. Nobody believed him, and now it happens, and they're just like, I don't know what to do. He's got to start from square one and convince them that he was God again. And he convinced them that there was a greater plan at work going on. So how is he going to do this? Like, how would you do this? If you had to convince someone that you were God and you just got executed, how do you change people's minds? Well, the first thing he does is, and I love how he does this because it's just completely illogical to how I would do it. So the prophecies have said up to this point that there's going to be a Messiah that's going to come. He's going to die and he's going to get risen from the dead. He's going to pay for everything. Like, people have known, they've been looking for this for a long time, but they don't really understand it. And so he rises from the grave, and if I was God and I was going to do this, I would come up from the grave, I would hover above the city, make lightning go everywhere, and be like, hello, everybody, you killed me, but here I am. Like, believe in me now, like, I'm God, Kazam. Like, it would be awesome. And instead, he rises from the dead when the only people that are there are the guards that just killed him. And so they freak out, and they leave, and they go and tell their superiors. They're like, hey, yeah, you know that guy that was dead? Like, I just saw him, and he just, like, came out of the grave, and now I don't really know what to do. And his ruling authorities are like, that's weird. Just don't tell anybody, okay? And so he rises from the dead, and the only people that see him are the people that actually killed him, and the most vested interest are keeping him in the grave. And so he doesn't have this crazy thing where he just, like, shows up to everybody. The next thing he does is that there was a bunch of women that had just watched him, that had been following him, kind of like his female entourage. And so they'd been following for a while. They go to, like, finish his burial process because it was really rushed when he got buried. So they're going to, like, wrap him and put some nice smelly spices on him and stuff. And so they go down to do this, and the grave is empty, and there's just angels hanging out. And they're like, hey, what's up? They're like, well, we were coming. There's a dead guy in here. We're going to hang out with him, but, like, obviously he's not there anymore. And the angels are like, yep, change of plans. Actually, he's alive now. So you don't worry about like the other stuff. Like, you're fine. He's alive. And go tell other people. How about that? So they're like, okay. So they run back to everyone. They tell the disciples that are all hiding, and nobody believes him. Like, this is, I mean, it's fun. Like, you wonder, you're like, okay, is the Bible true? Blah, 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 all these things. Nobody believes anyone in these stories. Like, if they were making this up, they'd be like, yes, they came back and everyone believed, and it was crazy. It's like, no, all the guys are hanging out in the women come in, they're all excited. They're like, he's alive. Like, Mary just saw him for real. And they're like, I don't believe you at all. That's insane. I know he's dead. Like, just leave. And so two of these guys that were there, they decide, I just need to walk this off. Like, this is probably, maybe you guys have experienced this, where maybe you come to church, all of a sudden everything clicks, and you're like, oh my gosh, Jesus is real. He's alive. I just had my sins forgiven. This is just crazy. You run into your homeroom and you're like, guys, Jesus is alive. And everyone's like, you're not allowed to say Jesus in public school. Please sit in the back. Thank you very much. If you say it again, you're going to the office. Like, you're done. And you're like, wait, but guys, he's real. And they're like, come on, man. It's homeroom. Like, I just woke up. Give me a break. Like, I don't want to hear about it. And one of the amazing things is, one of the women that went and saw Jesus and came back, she tells her husband, and he doesn't even believe. And so he's one of these guys that goes and takes a walk. His name is Cleopas. And so we know that his wife, when we look at it, was there. She watched Jesus get crucified. We don't know if he was. But like, sometimes even people in your own family, when you come and you tell them, you're like, I've seen Jesus. He's real. They're like, that's nice. I don't believe you at all. I'm going to take a walk. Sometimes I think the best thing you can do is let them just take that walk and like keep going on their own. And like, you're probably not gonna convince them. The only thing you can do is what Peter said in 1 Peter, and just keep being so awesome because of what you've experienced in Christ that they have to ask you that question. But he's walking along with another guy, and this is where we're gonna pick up. So if you open open the Bible that's under your feet. I'm only going to have the first couple verses on here, and then you're going to have to follow on your own. Turn to page 80. We're going to look at Luke chapter 24. So no, I don't think it's 80. 70. Yep, 70. My bad. We're going to look at Luke chapter 24, starting at verse 13. And we're going to look at how Jesus convinces someone of who he was. Not just based on showing up, but at looking at other aspects as well. And I think this is going to be extremely valuable for all of us. So we're going to look at verse 13, and we're going to read a ways down to, all the way down to 24. So that very day, the day that the women saw that Jesus was risen, they came back, told everyone, no one believed him. It says, that very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. I love that. They have all these questions. They're wondering what the heck is going on. They're discussing it, and Jesus himself shows up. Like, if you are looking for Jesus, if you're discussing, if you're searching, if you're trying to figure out, he's going to show up. Just keep walking. Like, I promise you. So he shows up. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. So he's kind of in disguise right now. Maybe he's got like a mustache or something. No, but they just don't recognize him. And so he said to them, what is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk? I love it. Like, he's God. He knows exactly what's going on. They're talking about him. And they're like, really? So they say, they stood still looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days? And he said to them, that's Jesus, what things? And they said to him, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back saying that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but him they did not see. That was Peter that went and checked it out, and one other guy. So they're basically telling Jesus, hey, have you been under a rock for the last couple of days? Because the whole nation was in an uproar. We thought the Messiah had come. We thought we were going to be risen to the grand top of the world again. Israel was going to be a superpower in the globe. Like all these prophecies were coming true. And then the guy died. And now here we are. But to top it off, he's not. Other people are saying that he's alive. Like my wife came to me this morning. She's like, hey, guess what, honey? Like, good news. Jesus is alive. I'm like, what the heck are you talking about? Like, what rock did you sleep on? Like, you're crazy. Like, what's going on? And so I love Jesus' response to this because Jesus is not afraid of these questions. He's explained it to these guys a million times. And I think a lot of times in the church, we're afraid to ask questions. So we're afraid to say, hey, I don't actually understand anything about Jesus, even though I've been coming to church for a long time. I feel like I have no idea what's going on. We're afraid to say, hey, I'm trying to do the right thing, but it doesn't seem like it's working. We're afraid to say, I don't understand my life. We're afraid to say we don't have all the answers for all of these questions. And these guys, they don't know it's Jesus. And so they're unafraid to ask these questions directly to God. They just say, God, we're so confused right now. We have no idea what's going on. And I think this is one of the best questions you can ask God. Be like, God, what the heck is going on? Like, I have no idea how to run my life. Everything that I seem to try to do is not working. I've heard conflicting things. Some people say to do this. Some people say to do that. I try to do my own thing. It blows up. My parents aren't happy. My friends aren't happy. Even my cat hates me. Like, I don't understand this life or how to go. And like, sometimes we're just scared to ask these questions. But I love that Jesus is not afraid to answer them and to spend time with them. So he said to them, okay, maybe he comes on a little harsh here. O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. He's like, guys, you're idiots. Like, I've been with you for 3 years telling you this was exactly what that was going to happen. And now it's happening and you can't even see it. Like, you can grow up your whole life in church and completely miss everything it's about. And so he says, was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. He goes through and he starts, so an idea here, he doesn't have the New Testament at this point. There's nothing that's been written about him. He goes back in the Old Testament and he says they interpret everything about himself and explains it to them. You're like, wait a second. I thought the Old Testament was the one we didn't read because it was weird and outdated. And it's got all like killing babies and stuff. Like, I don't understand. What do you mean he used those stories to point everyone to him? When you're reading the Bible, if you're not reading it looking for Jesus, you're reading it wrong. Like, if you're looking through saying, hey, okay, I'll read this story. How do I apply this to my life? Blah, blah, blah. Oh, he went through a tough circumstance. I went through a tough circumstance. Check. Like, I feel so much like I could be in the Bible. I had a tough day at school today. Like, just like Moses. It's like, no, that's not what the Bible is about. He probably told them stories. Like, if he's going back to Moses, that means all the books that Moses had written, the first 5 books, which these guys, is a pretty good chance they might have had memorized. I know Jesus did based upon what he went through. And so he could have looked back at Abraham and said, like, hey, like, Abraham was called to be a father to many nations. The Christ is going to be even better. He could have looked back at Moses and said, Moses redeemed his people Israel. The Passover, remember the Passover that we just celebrated about how there was a sacrificial lamb and that was how everyone was able to move forward and they weren't killed by the angel of death? Like, that is all pointing towards Jesus that would have to come and he would be that sacrificial lamb so that everyone else could have life and survive. He's like, remember that time when Moses got angry in the desert and he struck the rock and all the water came out so they could live? He's like, Jesus was the rock that got struck so that there would be living water that would come out and everyone could walk through that. He's like, remember all those baptisms we had? Like, remember how John was baptizing people to prepare for me to come. That's what they were talking about when Moses and all the Israelites went through the river, went through the Red Sea and it parted. That was all the foreshadow baptism. You guys remember David and how he was an Israelite king. And they said that through his lineage, someone would come. Maybe you guys don't remember, but my lineage was from David. Like I was part of the lineage of David. Jesus was. And that's how it was. And I am the new and the greater David that would come after that. All these prophecies would come. And so what happens? When you start looking at how Jesus defended himself, like when 1 Peter, when he says you need to defend your faith. How did Jesus do it? He didn't defend, he revealed. So Jesus doesn't need to be defended. Like a lot of times I feel like we think that we need to defend Jesus. And like the same way Peter had that karate chop action, like the Buzz Lightyear, you guys remember that Buzz Lightyear? People could just push his buttons and then he would do a karate chop, his wings would pop out. Like sometimes maybe you're that same way where someone comes up to you and they're like, evolution, and you're like, wings fly out and you're like, ah! Like I would defend the Jesus. Or like someone comes up and they're like, hey, the earth is probably old. And you're like, karate chop action, like, no. And it's just like, you pick these topics and you're like, I gotta defend. Like, how dare you use his name? Like, maybe you guys have been guilty of doing this where someone like says like, Jesus, like, and they're swearing and you're like, you better been praying right there. Like, I've always wanted to do that. I've never had the guts. Like you feel like you need to defend Jesus. But that's not what he did, is it? He revealed Jesus. He went back in the scriptures and he said, this is who Jesus was. Look at his character even before he was even here. Look at all these stories that point up to the need for him. And then look at what he did. Look, it matches perfectly. Well, you guys don't skip the Old Testament because it's boring. Read all those stories and then think about Jesus when you're doing it. Like, how is this about Jesus? How is this just like Jesus? You don't need to defend him. You need to reveal him. And so this can be either with your friends. If you open up the Bible and you say, hey, like I know we have all these doubts about Jesus, but look at all these prophecies, these books that were written hundreds and hundreds of years before him, and look at how they came true. You're like, that's incredible. And then you also need to reveal him and say, hey, look at me. I've been following Jesus and my life has been changed. I'm a different person. Look at what has happened to my life. You reveal him through your life as well. And so what happens when Jesus does this? I love what happens next. So they drew near to the village to which they were going. They had a 7-mile journey. They're talking the whole way, and they have not had enough. He acted as if he was going farther. So Jesus pretends like, hey guys, like, yeah, I got another meeting in the next town. I'll see you later. He's like, okay. And so, but they can't get enough of it. But they urged him strongly, saying, stay with us, for it's toward evening, and the day is now spent. So he went in to stay with them. When you're explaining and revealing Jesus, that's attractive. If you're doing it in a real way that people can understand. People are like, oh my gosh, like keep telling me, like what is going on? Like I don't even understand what you're saying, but it's incredible. And so what happens next? When he was at table with them, so they sit down for a meal, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. You remember at the beginning of the story, there was the Last Supper where we started looking where we picked up. And Jesus, during that time, he had said, guys, I'm going to die. Do this in remembrance of me. Take bread, break it. Maybe you guys have done this in one of the other church services. Break bread. Remember that my body is going to be physically broken for you. Drink wine and remember that my blood is going to be spilled for you. And they didn't get it at the time. They didn't get it. And so Jesus now, he takes the bread and he breaks it and he blesses it and he gives it to them. And it says, and their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, so he just poof, gone. When you're a God and you can do whatever you want, it's pretty cool what you can do. So they said to each other, did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures? Guys, when you read the Bible, and you make the Jesus connection to everything, your heart burns. Like I physically feel, like when I'm preparing a sermon, like I wait until my heart starts burning. I'm like, all right, there it goes. Like I found it. Like I'm not kidding. Like it literally feels like it's like pressure. Like maybe it's just I get really excited and my heart's beating fast. But either way, like I can like feel it. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's Jesus in the story. This is incredible. When your friends start to realize it, they'll be like, oh my gosh. Maybe some of that's the reason you keep coming back to Elevator to Waters Church, because you're like, I don't even understand it, but when he starts talking about Jesus, it's like I'm just drawn to it. I'm like, I don't know what's happening, but it's powerful. And so these guys are like, oh my gosh. Obviously, that was Jesus. Like, as he explained it, it was like the rest of the time when we were with him, and when he would explain things, and it would just open our eyes. And so what happens next? And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. So it's dark already. They're like sitting down for dinner. They're like, nope, like we got to get back. This is crazy. They just run back the 7 miles after walking 7 miles. Like that's 14 miles. That's a long time. And so they run back, and they found the 11 and those who were with them gathered, saying, the Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon. And they told what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. When they get it, when they understand, and they're like, oh my gosh, Jesus, he came and he died and he was a sacrifice, the same way we have the Passover sacrifice. And now we get to live in that knowledge. He's paid for everything. Oh my gosh, they just run back. They're like, I have to tell everyone. I have to tell everyone. And so they go back. And the miraculous thing is, the people, by this time, the disciples are a little bit more open to it. They're like, really? And then Jesus actually shows up in the room with them and reveals himself to them. And so after their hearts have been prepared, after they've realized this, they have a real personal encounter with the risen Jesus. And it changes everything. These guys go from being terrified and scared and having no idea what to do to all of a sudden now I'm here over 2,000 years ago preaching. Like that's because you don't get that from a dead guy that stays dead. You get that from people that experience Jesus in a real way and that have no option but to tell people. And the great thing is that he doesn't just, it's not like that's the only time he's ever showed up. Like, the reason this movement has kept going is because he keeps showing up. I've never seen him physically, but I've felt his presence. I know he's real. I've read the scripture, and it's like, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. This is incredible when I've read it. I've had addictions and things that were taken out of my life where I'm like, this is only God. I cried out in the name of Jesus, and he took this from me. Like, Jesus, the reason this movement keeps going is because he keeps impacting people and showing up for real time and time again. That's why we're all here. It's because that's happened to the people before us, and the people before them, and the generation before, all the way back since then, is he keeps showing up in a real way. And so when people ask you, what is the reason for your hope? Jesus is the reason for your hope. You can't say, I'm a Christian because it makes me into a good person, and like now things are good. Like who cares if you're a good person? Like if there is no Jesus, if there is no hope. Like without Jesus, there is no hope. It's incredible what he...